around. So hello from me. I'm Milena Deleva, the director of Elizabeth Kostova Foundation. The foundation has been around for 14 years, connecting writing communities from Bulgaria and the Anglosphere, figuratively and literally, and now this last 2 years also virtually. And CapitaLiterature is one of our annual and international programs that normally takes place in Sofia, following the annual Suzopo Fiction Seminars on Black Sea Coast. As you probably know, if you already attended some of the previous discussions, the focal theme this year is writers and influences. And here we go. It's a great pleasure to present Dimiter Kenarov, who is going to talk about the Bulgarian dissident author, Georgi Markov. Dimiter is quite versatile author himself. First, I got acquainted with the poet, then the translator, followed by the literary journalist, and finally the investigative journalist who was arrested in Belarus while on assignment. And last summer, I got to see him in action during the anti-corruption protest in Sofia when he was arrested literally in between sessions of workshop about writing about nature, which we put together. And you can see he loves nature. That's not a fake virtual background, and I'm sure Mitko can prove it. His non-fiction work has appeared in Esquire, Outside, The Nation, The Atlantic, Foreign Policy, The International, New York Times, the Virginia Quarterly Review, The New Yorker, among many others. He's currently working on biography of the Bulgarian author Georgi Markov, and that is going to be published soon by Grove Atlantic. Our moderator today is Peter Blackstock, who is the deputy publisher of Grove Atlantic. He also switches between genres and edits both fiction and non-fiction, with particular interest in international writers and work in translation. Authors he publishes include Viet Thanh Nguyen, Bernardine Evaristo, Douglas Stewart, Sayaka Murata, Tom Stoppard, and Dimiter Kenarov. Originally from the United Kingdom, Peter studied German and Russian and even some Bulgarian while attending university. He came to Suzopo as a visiting speaker back in 2015. Before I turn it over to Dimiter, just briefly some practicalities. So after the presentation and the moderated conversation, we will open the Q&A for you because we'd love to hear from you. Actually, you can post your questions while the conversation is going on. And if you are watching us via the Facebook live stream but need translation in Bulgarian, please join the Zoom call. Ако ни гледате през Facebook, но имате нужда от превод на български, моля присъединете се към Zoom събитието. Линка ще бъде постнат на Facebook страницата на Фондация Елизабет Костова. Special thanks to the US Embassy in Bulgaria, Sofia Municipality, our interpreter today, again, Elena Alexieva. That being said, Dimiter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Milena. It's a real pleasure to participate in this event. And thank you, Peter, for being here as well. Peter is my editor. And I love your matching shirts, by the way, Milena and Peter.
I know we planned that secretly, but we didn't tell you, which is very cruel. But
yes.
Next time we'll let you in on the joke.
I'll put on my yellow shirt next time. But this is a real background. It's true. It's not a virtual one. Here's a little leaf to prove that. I'm currently in Varvara, which is a small village on the Black Sea coast. Yeah, this is the only place where they have good internet connection. So I'm sorry if there's a lot of bird song or cats mewing and caterwauling or dogs barking. But it's gonna be a nice actually sort of soundtrack to this event, I think. So let's get started. Georgi Markov. When I was growing up, basically I didn't know much about him except what every Bulgarian knows, and this is the Bulgarian umbrella, the way that Markov was murdered, and the whole sort of cloak and dagger story. and it was something that I was not interested in for a long time, because it felt to me that this is one of those stories that are somehow stereotypical of the region. It's like yogurt, is Bulgarian, and rose oil, and then there's Georgi Markov and the murder. And I've always tried to escape sort of the stereotypes that bedevil Bulgaria and this region oftentimes, and the only things that come out as interesting to foreign audiences. So for a long time, I was trying to stay away from this subject, because I thought, well, I just don't want to be part of this narrative, really. But when I came back from the States in 2011, I started getting more and more interested in my own country, in Bulgaria, in what was going on. And I came across his 2 volumes of his essays, radio essays, called In Absentia Reports about Bulgaria. And those are the essays that Markov actually broadcast over Radio Free Europe between 1975 and 1978, and became the direct reason, reason for his murder. And when I read those 2 volumes, I was completely struck by how accurately and intimately he had managed to describe the whole atmosphere in Bulgaria between the coming of the communist regime in 1944, right at the end of the war, and the time Markov left Bulgaria in 1969. So those reports are really, those essays were really something that created, for me, the most comprehensive panorama of Bulgaria during that period. And Mark, they're small essays, small anecdotes and profiles and political commentary, not very different actually from Dostoevsky's Writer's Diary, which Markov took as sort of a model for these reports. And Dostoevsky, by the way, was one of his favorite writers. And when I read this book, I thought, wow, this is something that I'm interested in. This person. Who was that person? What happened to him? Why do we know only about the murder? Why do we know only about the so-called Bulgarian umbrella? And why don't we know more about this person? And I ended up writing an essay, a big feature for The Nation magazine, and sort of exploring his life and what was happening to him, and the kind of investigation that was going on so many years after his murder. And then it was the widow of Georgi Markov, Annabelle, who contacted me and actually really loved that essay and wanted me to want us to meet. So we did, and we ended up talking and discussing a possible book, and so at one point I just had Georgi Markov's letters and had the archives. His Bulgarian cousin Lyuben Markov had archives as well. And once I started reading his letters, once I started getting to know this person more and more, I really became fascinated, because to me this became a story not about a murder so much, although the murder is part of the story, as much as one person's loneliness, both in Bulgaria and abroad. And that loneliness really struck a personal chord that felt something that I myself had experienced in a way, being sort of a person who couldn't really find my place in Bulgaria and couldn't quite find my place in the United States as well. And so when I came back, I thought that maybe the biggest freedom is not to leave a country, but to be able to come back. And so once I was back in Bulgaria, I started doing more and more research about him, and just finding a way into this book that I started writing. which, as I said, is not so much kind of a cloak and dagger story that the usual journalistic narrative somebody would have written, but is more of a story about a person's psyche, his complexities as a character, his own insecurities, and I thought that was a story that's really fascinating. Now, I want to say just a couple of words about Markov himself. He was born in 1929, while Bulgaria was still a monarchy, and he grew up actually in the 30s in all around the western towns of Bulgaria, where his father, who was a sergeant major, was stationed in the 1930s. And so when at the tail end of the war, just before the communists moved in, his father contracted tuberculosis, and the family had to return to Sofia, where they lived together with the father's parents. And so this was sort of Georgi's return to Sofia, in a sense, coincided with the beginning of the communist regime. And initially his family did not like the communists very much, but you did not have a lot of choice at that time, but to really adapt yourself to what was going on, to the situation. I mean, the longer that communist rule was, the longer that communist rule was, the smaller the hope was for any kind of change, political change. So Markov actually, he studied for chemical engineer. He wasn't a writer initially, but he also contracted tuberculosis, and while in a sanatorium, he started writing stories. And in the 1950s, he started publishing books. Those books, they're like crime stories. By the way, his very first book, which is absolutely fascinating, it's called Cesieva Nosh, Cesium Night. And it begins with a scene of this old professor dying in a hospital, and nobody knows why he's dying. And everybody's trying to look for some kind of cure. And it's exactly like the scene of Georgi Markov's death. I mean, that's sort of, it's almost uncanny sometimes how literature and life merge together. But those books, he wrote crime stories, he wrote science fiction. He tried to sort of adapt himself to the market at the time, to what was modern, what was contemporary. He really was not a person to look back into the past very much. He was always looking for kind of the contemporary music. He was very much into jazz. He was very much into sort of the contemporary literary movements, and so those first books were sort of experiments trying to figure out his genres, and they're not really great. I mean, he himself admitted that they did not hold much literary value. And same was, and then he continued to write sort of more realist stories, but in a kind of a socialist realist vein, which was the sort of de rigueur, the sort of the main genre that was acceptable, the main kind of literature that was acceptable at the time. And in 1962, he sort of came to prominence with this book called Men. It was the story of three young men who come out of the army, and then each and every one goes into a different career, different route. And that the book is, again, this is not one of his great books, but it made his reputation at the time in Bulgaria, and he was accepted as part of the Writers' Union. To be part of the Writers' Union was to be a writer. Nobody could really be called a writer unless the regime sort of put their stamp of approval on you. And so as the way the communist regime was controlling literature and all the entire cultural sphere, it was an ideological instrument. So everything was kept. The whole cultural sphere was kept very, very close, and it was watched closely. It was very well funded. Writers were some of the famous and sort of richest people sort of in the cultural sphere. There were writers' residences all over Bulgaria. There were all kinds of subsidies and so on and so forth. And for the best ones, there would be apartments and cars and all kinds of privileges, which the regime gave to its writers in order to draw them close, in order to make them obedient. And a lot of people, the regime, think of this monolithic communist regime, but actually it had different stages, right? At first, it was very brutal, the kind of Stalinist period where a lot of purges happened, where people were sent to camps, to prisons, and so on and so forth. And those things, of course, the prisons and violence continued throughout the regime. But in the 1950s, with the thaw that was happening in the Soviet Union under Khrushchev, there was sort of a liberalization of that environment, and Markov was part of that liberalization. So he came to see sort of the softer side of communism, and so he became in the 60s a really prominent writer. His plays were everywhere in Soviet theaters. His books were published. He was a kind of a bon vivant. Was driving a silver BMW. In a time when even Soviet-made cars were really a rarity. And so, and he was gambling. He was a big gambler, loved poker. And this was, he was spending tons of money on gambling. And there is a wonderful novella called The Portrait of My Double, which describes that sort of atmosphere. And in the late 60s, though, especially after the crushing of the Prague Spring by the forces of the Warsaw Pact, the regime sort of contracted again. I mean, it was like kind of like a heart, it can contract and expand and become more liberal and more conservative depending on the agenda at the time. But after 68, that sort of fairly liberal again. I mean, it's relatively liberal environment. I wouldn't call it a liberal one because obviously it was part of a totalitarian regime. But the fairly liberal environment became more and more conservative. And Markov at the time was having more and more doubts about himself and how he was serving the regime and how many compromises he had to make in order to publish his work. To have, at a certain time, he sort of figured that it was impossible to eat your cake and have your cake and eat it too. In Bulgaria, that would be the proverb. You can have to have the lamb full, the lamb whole, and the wolf full. And so he sort of figured out that both things are contradictory. They cannot really coexist with each other. And he was becoming more and more conscious of how he was serving that regime and what was happening and what was his role in that regime. And his dream always had been to really escape that environment, to be able to appear on this regime and to human freedom was in a sense the sort of the spark that initiated sort of his move, his decision to move to Italy. Now he moved to Italy completely legally. He didn't run away. He had a passport. There's a lot of Bulgarian writers, Bulgarian artists who were close to the regime, who had these privileges. He had a privilege to travel abroad, which was, the right to travel was probably the biggest privilege you could get. And so he left Italy. He left for Italy, and he wasn't thinking at the beginning whether if he'd return or not. But he decided. I think it was like a sort of a gradual process that the longer he stayed, the harder it became to come back, and then sort of it was a vicious circle that he was entering, and the regime started taking down his place. They started, there were these rumors about the traitor Georgi Markov, who had left the country. Even Zhivkov, there was this conversation that he had with other writers where he said, well, Georgi Markov is a good writer, but he's not ours. And, taking under consideration all of this, things that were happening back in Sofia, he figured out that there is no future for him, and he decided to seek his luck abroad. He really didn't speak any languages. He started learning Italian while he was in Italy. He was at his brother's house. Then he couldn't find his place in Italy. I mean, he was from a somebody, he turned into a nobody. I think that's a sort of a major move that I also want to explore. And the way, other people like Solzhenitsyn or other people who were persecuted by the state, you can understand why they escaped in a sense, because they didn't have anything to lose but their chains, as Marx would say. But really with him, it was different. He had everything to lose. He had all the privileges, all the money, all the sort of prestige, everything. And he threw that away for a dream, for something that, he thought he could take a shot at. And in Italy, while he was in Italy, he couldn't really do anything. He was an unknown writer, didn't speak the language. But then through a director friend of his, he ended up going to Great Britain, and where he slowly started. He lived in a small rented place with other immigrants, Bulgarian immigrants. He slowly started learning English, and he ended up working for the Bulgarian section of the BBC. And that's how he got into radio. And radio at the time was like the internet of that day, right? I mean, it was the regime could control the publishing industry and what was being read, but it wasn't that easy to control what came through the airwaves. I mean, there was jamming, of course, which was extremely expensive, but overall, it was the way that Western countries tried to put across their message during that time, and that's why state security, which was the secret service, the secret police, the political police of the regime, they were always extremely worried about radio broadcasts because they called them ideological diversion. For them, that was akin to terrorism, really. And so they followed all of these broadcasts very closely, and they wrote reports about them. And all people who worked for these radio stations were considered enemies of the people, and basically some of the most dangerous criminals. So Markov ended up working not only for the BBC but for Deutsche Welle, the German broadcaster, which had a Bulgarian section broadcasting in Bulgarian across the Iron Curtain. And same was with Radio Free Europe, where Markov ended up writing his in absentia reports. And so he really became this sort of like big figure in the Bulgarian dissident circles. Bulgaria had never had like an organized dissident movement of that sort, and so Markov became an institution by himself. And so the regime started considering him an extremely dangerous person. There were a lot of reports about him and so on. And finally, they ended up cooking up this crazy scheme to kill him. KGB in the Soviet Union. They did so in 1978 on Waterloo Bridge. But again, to me, the story of Markov is not the murder is part of it. It's what made him famous. It's what made him sort of into a hero in a sense. Death is always like that for heroes. But to me, the struggle to build up a career in Bulgaria first, to throw away everything, to start from scratch, and in extreme loneliness and isolation, to be somebody and then a nobody, and then to be a somebody again. That's the kind of narrative arc I'm interested in, and that's what draws me to that person. I think we could start like a conversation. This is sort of the general story of Markov's life, and I don't want to talk more about that. I think that's sort of sufficient for our audience to sort of understand the kind of person he was. But maybe it would be good to start a conversation with Peter and you know, talk about more
that
about the
sounds
approach.
great. Yeah, and so thanks so much for that. I mean, that was really fascinating, and you really get a sense of like, I mean, if you read Dimiter's writing, like it's as rich and even more rich, if you can imagine, than what he's sort of been describing. I mean, it's just sort of every detail, every aspect of it, you really feel and you really see when you read his work. It's been really fun, kind of reading some early chapters from the Georgi Markov book over the last few months, and you know, it's kind of was occurring to me that like, you know, you're obviously the ideal person to write this book and to take Markov as a subject, not least because, of course, you understand the period and the context, but you know, because of the reflections on your own like writer's psychology and being between these two different worlds, and it's fascinating to kind of imagine like a version of Markov born 50 years later. Like what would he be doing if he were like, you know, born sort of in the same time around you were, and but yes, it's just it's interesting that, I mean, you talk a lot about, well, maybe we could just start with the idea of the writing. So you've got this project, you've got this idea, you've been approached by the widow, you've gone and met her and read the letters and the letters from the cousin. You've got, you know, this incredible story stretching out before you, and probably lots of documents, lots of books. Like, how do you take that and then start writing? What's your process to bring that to the page?
Right. I mean, that is, I think, the problem with every single writer of nonfiction. The amount of material that's out there. Okay, you know, some nonfiction, you know, there's like a dearth of material. There's a lack of material, and then, you know, that's a problem too. But with Markov, what you know, started happening is that I started accumulating a lot of material because this story has so many different facets. There is, of course, his life in Bulgaria, his early life in Bulgaria, his rise up in the cultural sphere, and then you have, you know, his move to Great Britain, where he by the way started writing these wonderful letters with his, you know, exchanging these letters with his lover at the time, Yana Pipkova, who was the daughter of a famous Bulgarian composer, Ljubomir Pipkov. So these letters are absolutely fascinating, and there are many of them. And then you have this then the life abroad, which contains a lot of material as well. But then the murder itself, you know, I had to just to give you a sense, you know, of sort of the scope of this project. When I started researching it, I was lucky enough to have the Bulgarian investigation released to the public. It was before that it was secret, but because of the statute of limitations that Bulgaria has, so there was an investigation that started in the late 90s and continued on until 2013. But when the statute of limitation, you know, sort of expired, they released these documents, the entire investigation, which is 48 volumes of material that these investigators had collected. And I ended up actually getting permission to use these documents. And to me, the most fascinating thing was, again, you know, as a writer, was not the murder itself and how they follow the different tracks, but the interviews that I had done with friends of Markov in the early 90s, long interviews, long interrogations, that you know, where they talk not about the murder, about his life and so on and so forth. So this was a great material for me. Now the letters also in the archive in London is extremely interesting, but a lot of the letters are handwritten, so you spend hours and hours trying to decipher letters. You know, and I was lucky, as I said, to work with the Bulgarian cousin who had collected for the, you know, at the time almost 25 years, 30 years material that was like newspaper clippings and everything that had appeared, which was an enormous amount of material, videos of people he had recorded who were his friends but are no longer alive, which to me was a great source. So I was taking notes on all of these things and trying to sort of regurgitate all this material. And that's the hardest part, because as a writer, you end up using just a minuscule part of all of that, maybe like 5% of all of your research. And it's frustrating because you know that you know so much, you know enormous amounts of information. But for the narrative to be good and to be captivating for the reader, you have to know exactly which parts to use and how to position yourself. And I think that's sort of half of the writer's craft. It's not so much the writing, but the selection of what you write about.
Yes, no, and as you say, there's so much work that goes into the sentence of what they were eating for lunch or whatever it is that kind of just brings the whole thing alive. I mean, you think about like, shooting a period drama or something, and the painting that you've got to like get a replica of that's in shot for like 2 seconds, but without those kind of details, it doesn't come alive. And that's what I think is, you do so amazingly. You just feel that exactly what you're writing about, and that you're not using like the liberties of your imagination to do it. It's you're imagining as little as possible. And I mean, maybe you could talk a bit about like Markov's love life. I mean, you mentioned Yana, and there's these wonderful letters, as you said, between him and her, and that's their relationship is in the early chapters of the book, is really intriguing. And she's a very strong character, strong person too. So I'd love to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, well, Markov had 2 marriages in Bulgaria. One was a very early marriage while he was extremely young, 22 years old. And then that marriage gradually fell apart, and he ended up marrying another woman in 1963, and Zdravka Lekova. And they were a good couple, but I think that Markov was also a womanizer at the time. He that was sort of an accepted thing, and you could actually sort of feel it in a lot of his work as well. The kind of attitude that people, him included, had toward women, which was a very patriarchal attitude in a sense. It was men were on top. They controlled those spheres of public life, of cultural life, but that was true, I think, in a lot of cases of other parts in the world as well, including Western Europe. And he started this affair with Yana Pitkova in 1968, a year before he left. And there was sort of a scandal because they were both married. Yana Pitkova was actually married to an extremely famous Bulgarian film director, Rangel Volchanov, at the time. And so they were both married, and they flaunted their love affair in front of everybody in Sofia. So there was a lot of gossip, a lot of admiration too. They were this power couple basically, and so they really felt close to each other, and you could feel that in the letters themselves, because when Markov was abroad, it was actually less than a year that they had dated before he left abroad, and they started exchanging letters almost every single day. And so you could feel, and Markov at one point in his life, at the end of his life, actually, he wrote some of the most beautiful things are the letters I've written to Yana. But he also ended up, these letters are sort of love letters, but also political ruminations and sort of kind of this ruminations about his own career as a writer. And he got her into real trouble with state security at home because he was safely abroad, but Yana was back home, and so she ended up being interrogated by state security constantly. They would intercept their letters and read them. The letters, it's interesting. I would say that the love letters that Markov wrote are the reason that the regime started really sort of following him, and he had this falling with the regime, because in between all the love that he was sort of expressing, there were all these political sort of.
It's interesting that moment, because he must have known that he was exposing himself, that those letters were going to get read. And as you say, Yana writes back to him, please don't write about these, just don't write about the things that you're writing about. Just tell me that you love me and you miss me, because she's worried, obviously for him to a certain degree, but she's also worried for herself. So why do you think he did that? Why wasn't he more careful?
Well, he was it's an interesting question. You know, he would, whenever she said, please don't write to me about anything but love. And she would actually send these messages to a friend of hers in Italy, so that state security would not be able to intercept this. And so, but he can, you know, and for a while he would stop writing about politics, but then he would continue doing that. I think there was a sense of, you know, personal vanity to a certain extent. He was angry at the regime and what was going on, and I think once you're abroad, you sort of quickly start forgetting what it's like to be at home. You feel this atmosphere of freedom and you want to express your thoughts freely and you don't want to censor yourself in a sense. But that also, you know, I think he was always a fantasist in a sense. He was never very securely, you know, with his feet on the ground. He always was a dreamer. And I think to a certain extent that prevented him from being a more practical man. But so he didn't write these kind of political thoughts only to Jana. He actually wrote to other people as well. Not many, but there were other letters. But yeah, I think there was a sort of, he was seeing Jana as this person he could open up his soul to, and that included his political views as well.
It's sort of hard to imagine these days how little information or how much misinformation there would have been in like, you know, Eastern Europe and in Soviet, you know, Soviet controlled Soviet bloc countries about the West. And so I'm sure he felt like he just so excited to tell her really and everyone else that he could about all that he was discovering and what he was living through. And you know, it's interesting. I mean, it's hard to imagine almost that kind of like how radical, like, and how exciting that kind of information would be, or that kind of life experience to be able to talk about that. You know, it's sort of these days, writers, we don't think of writers as like, you know, dangerous people, and we do sometimes, but obviously at that moment, you know, if you were a writer that was or a cultural figure, but perhaps particularly a writer that was not in concord with the regime, you're extremely dangerous, as you said. And but I mean, to what extent did Georgi, I mean, having worked closely with the regime before that point, and having sort of written plays about the history of communism in Bulgaria, and you know, had these plays put on and celebrated, and then be driving this like silver BMW around Sofia. I mean, he must have just, like, you think about the dialectical sort of like contrast and like dynamic within him. He obviously really, to some extent, believed in the ideas of bringing a better future for working people, but he was flaunting his own kind of wealth and his own status too. So what do you think about that? I mean, that makes him an interesting figure to follow, because he's not just you know, he's not like trying to get rich, or he's not just egotistical. He's writing also about things that he really believes in, and political ideas of yeah, liberation and freedom, and so on. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's, as I said earlier, that's these kind of contradictions that you see is part of what makes him interesting as a character and what makes him human to a certain extent. That he was an idealist. I think he did believe. I mean, a lot of people think of him as anti-communist. I think he was a social democrat. I think he, you know, criticized. You know, once he went abroad, he criticized sort of the Western market and how, you know, the market structured labor relations. Basically, from a Marxist perspective, he was talking about the fetishism, you know, of commodities, and how, you know, everybody in the West was obsessed with that. So, in a sense, you know, he was an idealist. He did believe in a sort of in a more just, a free world. But he also, you know, there was this drive in him as well of trying to prove himself better than others. In a sense, there was this individualistic streak, a very, very strong individualistic streak, where he, you know, he wanted to be apart from the common herd, and I think, and he wanted to, you know, as every writer has a huge ego, and that's sort of a driving force. And he wanted to be famous. He wanted to be, not at any price, but he wanted to be famous at sort of on his own terms. and you know, some of the his Radio Free Speech Europe, and he started getting threatened. He felt also a sort of pride that his essays were strong enough that they considered him a threat to the country. So there was this personal vanity as well. And you know, in England, he never became a rich person or anything like that. I think he never cared about money. That's like a lot of, I've spoken to a lot of people. He spent money, you know, as much as he earned, he spent immediately. So money was not a driving force for him, but definitely, but the social justice, there was this one side of him, and freedom, but also in a sense, individualism, and he believed that society can change only through the individual change. He never truly believed that you can put on an idea, over like lead over a society and change that society like that. He really believed that social change always pass through through individual change. And I think those sort of the social and the individual, the vain person and the kind of idealistic, sort of person, this persona, and oftentimes they're hard to square together. But that's part of human life, I think.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and you sort of talking about his idea of being a great man or wanting to be a great man, and his gambling and other things, where you've mentioned like his influence from Dostoevsky, or his love of Dostoevsky, and you think about that kind of like the individuality and that like Dostoevsky is writing about in so many of the protagonists of his novels, the person that knows something that's really important, but also knows that they stand out from the crowd. And you can imagine how that how much why that work really resonated with him. What other influences do you feel like he sort of had? Were there particular literary influences or artistic or musical influences on his work? And I was thinking about, just when you were talking about Mayakovsky and the way that he sort of, as a very individualist kind of poet, so much threw his lot in with the revolution and became a revolutionary poet many years before. But who else were people that influenced Markov?
Yeah. Well, he read tons. I mean, he loved all the Russian classics, of course. He never was like an anti-Russian person. He loved the entire Russian tradition. He did not like the Soviet tradition at all, but he loved all the big ones. He loved Tolstoy as well, and Gogol and so on. He loved sort of the French as well. I mean, he read a lot of Maupassant as a young person, and as a sort of an older man. Sort of in the 1960s, when he was getting into drama, he really loved the theater of the absurd that was just coming out. So Edward Albee was an influence, and Beckett. They were not interesting. Albee was put on like in Bulgarian theater several times. Beckett, he was considered sort of too, too dark
Nihilistic.
and nihilistic. Yeah. But people, for example, read like Waiting for Godot. Somebody would have the original French, and they would go to a party and they would read it and translate it at the same time, and people would listen because people did not speak a lot of languages. So that kind of atmosphere where somebody got like something that really famous, and but there was no way to translate it and to publish it and to distribute it. So people would have like these home parties where they would read a book or a play, and they would translate it while reading it. And later in life, while in England, he wrote tons of reviews. I mean, he was a big fan of Sao Bello, actually. He loved Bello's writing, and he, I mean, if you start, he went and basically reviewed almost every single kind of big figure in the 1970s, and I think that was a way for him to open up his perspective on the world that was denied him, before that. And I think he loved it. As I said, he was also very much into jazz music, into classical music, into opera. I don't think he was very much into sort of contemporary you know, in the 1970s when he went to London, I mean, it was like the punk rock scene, you know, and sort of glam rock, all these things that you know I'm putting into my book as well. But I don't think he was that much influenced by that atmosphere. I think he was a more traditional, kind of like the big figures of literature and of music, more than sort of the super like new ones, the punk rock ones. Yeah.
No, interesting. And I know we've got one question in the Q&A at least, but if there's more, then please do type up your questions, and we'll get to those in a moment. But just before that, maybe you've talked to me about the idea of sort of avoiding some of the pitfalls of biography when you're writing this book. Like what don't you want to do? You probably don't want us to put like a giant umbrella on the cover of this book. Though
No.
who knows? Maybe. But I can imagine there are ways that you want to sort of avoid these stereotypes about Bulgaria or about this figure, but also, you know, maybe avoid some of the cliches of biography. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Right. I mean, I honestly, I've always been interested in narrative journalism, you know, for the past, or not always, for the past, you know, let's say 15 years. But biography has always been a little bit problematic for me because, you know, I hate sort of the traditional cradle to grave biographies, where you have to wait for so long until the person grows up and becomes interesting. I mean, some people are interesting as children, but not that much. And and so I thought that, you know, a more interesting approach would be actually not, and also this sort of academic quoting constantly of you know, putting in quotes and quotes and quotes, and he said this and he said that and she said that, and I think that sort of boggle. I mean, it's interesting if you're writing again, I'm saying if you're writing an academic biography, I think that's great because it gives you a sense of sort of you know, who said what about this person, what was the context of this person very clearly. But my idea of biography is more you know, kind of a nonfiction novel where every sentence that you write is based on some kind of research, some kind of material that you've read, and so but it's not necessarily direct quotations. You just regurgitate all this material into a single narrative. I mean, I like a lot of, for example, recently I was reading the biography of of Limonov by Edward Carrère, and it's kind of a controversial biography because he sort of, it's in the present tense, you know, it's written like a novel, but it just draws you in. I want as a reader to be drawn in by the narrative, by the drama of this whole thing, by the language, the style. I think is super important, and so I feel that writing a biography for me is not so much telling sort of academically telling the story of Georgi Markov, but telling my own story in a sense, telling what I'm interested in, the way I want to present this figure. Maybe I can read like a little passage.
Yeah, perhaps you should read some. Yeah, maybe just for 1 or 2 minutes, because I've got a few questions which are coming in, so I don't want to make sure we have time for those. But yeah, it'd be great to hear your style.
Sure. So this is actually from the time when he was in Italy, and you know, he would go out. He was in his brother's house in a small hamlet, Battedizzo, near Bologna, and oftentimes, you know, he was so lonely, and he would oftentimes get into his car and go to Bologna and just wander the streets by himself. And a lot of it is like in the letters to Iana and other letters. So this is you know, how it goes. Sometimes, desperate to divert himself, Georgi would make a quick trip to nearby Bologna. He'd stroll along the city's endless porticoed streets, where voices and steps echoed from all directions, and the lithe shadows of the colonnades fell across the ground in flawless geometric patterns. Past cozy restaurants and corner bars packed with university students quaffing jugs of wine and debating with vigor the advantages of communism, Bologna being the heartland of the Italian Communist Party. Past the cramped market stalls of the CapitaLiterature, where greengrocers and butchers and bakers hawk their luscious goods, and finally into Piazza Maggiore with its wide open spaces chock full of tourists. Georgi often saw there an elderly woman sitting between two scintillating shop windows. She bore a vaguely aristocratic air, he noted, and gave her change whenever he could spare some. He liked the rose-tinted beauty of Bologna, the medieval basilicas and palazzi, but it was the large number of destitute and homeless people in the streets, whom it was nearly impossible to come across in Bulgaria, that really caught his attention. Beggars calling out, "Have mercy on the poor," wretches exposing their prosthetic legs to elicit sympathy, blind men following the passers-by with the unseeing whites of their eyes, and dog shit everywhere, dog shit left behind by the pets of the wealthy. Dante had supposedly studied in Bologna and included in the Inferno a vivid description of one of the city's famous leaning towers, Garisenda, comparing it to the terrifying giant Antaeus. But it wasn't Dante's hell that Georgi came to find out on his outings in Bologna as much as a kind of purgatory. Unknown, unnoticed, walking in a circle of self-same days, he had turned into a homeless man lost among the homeless. Quote, "I rove mindlessly along the resplendent crowded streets, past smug alien faces of alien people, a Martian who has accidentally landed in Bologna," he wrote to Jana. At age 40, maybe he was condemned to wander lost for another 40 years. I can, well, do we have, I'll read like one more paragraph. He often sought refuge in one particular pub in a small side street of Bologna. It had old shelves lined with bottles covered in dust and cobwebs, long wooden tables and a low dark ceiling where, he told Tiana, the only thing missing were bats. The proprietor seemed as sad and gloomy as his establishment. Georgi would sit down sipping Spanish wine and watch quietly the few other quiet customers, their cheeks and noses reddened by drink. What impressed him the most was that the place dated back to 1410. He liked to imagine all the famous people that might have been there once, drinking the same wine, Copernicus, Tasso, Rossini, Donizetti. That link to the past was comforting, as it offered him a much-needed sense of belonging, of something like a ghostly community. Bulgaria, though an ancient country in its own right, founded in 681, had no such pubs. It had suffered too many invasions over the centuries, Byzantines, Ottomans, communists, each new ruler razing to the ground the heritage of the one before. The communists especially had shown utmost fervor in the project. Destroying the old bourgeois world and building a new, better one over its ashes was, after all, part of their revolutionary ideology. Perhaps that was the real problem. There wasn't the feeling of continuity back home, Georgi thought, and each person considered himself the center of the universe, the alpha and the omega. He was spoiled by that view as well, and one of the reasons he had left Bulgaria was to be part of a wider world. Yet there was no escaping the fact that in that wider world, he was a nobody. Many Italians didn't even know where Bulgaria was, often mistaking it for neighboring Turkey. This was both heartening. Anonymity could allow him to start over on his own terms and test with what his talent was really worth, but also terribly oppressive for somebody who had been used to the spotlight for so long. Quote, "Never in my life have things been so dire for me," he wrote in another letter to Jana. "It's terrible to admit I'm on the bottom of despair. I'm a foreigner at home and a Bulgarian abroad."
Wow, wonderful. Thanks so much for that. I mean, it really just takes us right to that place and right into his mind, which is just the magic of this kind of nonfiction. So to go to the questions, well, there's one or a couple of questions about Markov's own books and their availability in English. The latest edition is from 40 years ago. Someone says, are there any, is there any possibility of reissues of his work? Do you know of?
Well, not really. There was in 1983 came out sort of a selection of his in obscenity reports in English called "The Truth That Killed." It's sort of about 300-page volume. It's out of circulation. It's very difficult to find, only in all bookstores, and basically I've translated a couple of his essays for Plowshares, for various other journals, and the good news is that Angela Rodell, the Bulgarian translator, translated a selection, 4 of Markov's best novellas from the late 1960s, which are supposed to come out of Penguin, along with my book. So we'll have something by Markov soon.
Yes, we're hoping for a joint sort of Markov, what could we call it? Like a celebration and kind of rediscovery. So that's what we're hoping for with the reissues of those books, or with the issues of those books, that book in English. A question about in England: to what extent did he have friendships with contemporary literary figures in England? Was he accepted? Did he write in English?
That's an excellent question, actually. In his early letters, from England. Markov really, he said, I want to forget Bulgarian. I want to be an English language writer. And he was actually even keeping for a while a diary in English. He really wanted to be accepted by the British literary scene. And but unlike Russian emigres who have all the networks of like university networks, public publishers, translators, and so on and so forth. Bulgaria was probably the least known country, along with Albania, in the sort of Soviet sphere of influence, and so it was very difficult for him to even translate his work. So he worked with various translators, but the translations are not good at all. So he felt this wall of like this linguistic wall that he couldn't really go across. And so he was while in England, he didn't manage actually to meet a lot of famous literary people. He wanted to. I mean, he met some people in the BBC, some writers that he was working with as well. But he never managed to sort of fulfill that dream of meeting sort of the cream, of British literary life at the time. So he remained fairly unknown until his death.
No, very interesting. And then a question from Alexander Tomov, a really kind of nice, it's quite a long question, so I might just sort of elide some of it. But dear Mr. Kenarov, Mr. Blackstock, dear hosts, I am deeply enjoying this illuminating discussion. I thank you for it. I've had an interesting Georgi Markov story before. It was in the most recent print edition of Markov's In Absentia reports with a preface by Mr. Kenarov that really immersed me into the time period, the writing style, and a very authentic view of life in Bulgaria during the period. My question, I believe Georgi Markov's life in his own zeitgeist is far more fascinating than his assassination, as you've sort of said. However, his tragic end does seem to prove a point about his opus vitae, and it feels like this kind of story would make an incredible film. Have you considered adapting your upcoming book into a script?
Well, dear producers, please, please read the book. Yes, well, it's true. I mean, I think that makes a great movie, but it could be taken in a lot of different ways. I guess it could be done like a spy movie, like the TV series The Americans or something like that, which has value in its own right. But again, I hope that one day, if any producer is interested in this, they'd be interested in Markov precisely for the reason I was interested in, because of his life and because of his complicated sort of relationship to both the Bulgarian regime and to the reality he found in Great Britain and in London at the time. And so the murder, again, I think it's absolutely indispensable to the story. It's what makes the story, in a sense. But it shouldn't. Again, I don't see this as a movie solely focused on the murder itself.
No, that's definitely what we'll hope for. And once we have a version of the book, we'll start sort of sending it out and doing our bit as the publisher to get it in the hands of some of those people that would adapt it with that kind of thoughtfulness too. So we're looking at an early 2023 publication probably, but we'll see. It sort of depends on the timing. But watch this space. And then I think one more question we probably have time for just quickly from Facebook. Tom Edward Phillips asks, what fascinates me is that Markov's reportage from the West is quite a strange mix of nostalgia and anti-nostalgia for in absentia, Bulgaria. Perhaps an impulse that most of us have for what might have been. Do you want to talk about nostalgia and anti-nostalgia?
That's very true. Actually, in the opening of the In Absentia reports, Markov talks about his two impulses. And one is to, as he says, to start a new book in a new language, to completely cut off the past and completely forget it and begin over. And the other impulse is, he calls it the King Trajan story, which is also the Midas story. I mean, it appears in different versions of the person who wanted to tell a secret and he had to dig a hole and tell the secret that King Midas had the donkey ears and had to tell the story to the ground, in that hole in the ground, because he just couldn't keep it into himself. He couldn't, it was too much for him. So in a sense, I think he gave in to that second impulse, that, you know, that he wanted to look at his past and what had happened. Although, as I said in the beginning, he was not a nostalgic person. He was a person who very much looking forward. But in a sense, you know, being that alone in Great Britain, you know, looking into the past was almost sort of like a Freudian reworking of his past, of his traumas, of everything. And in order to continue forward, you have to look back, in a sense. I feel to a certain extent this is part of the personal function of the in absentia reports for him.
Wonderful. Well, I don't see any other questions in particular. I suppose we're already slightly over time, I think. So perhaps we should wrap things up. I don't know if there's any other final thought you have that you want to share, Dimiter?
Well, I'm just very, very happy that, you know, we're able to have this discussion, you know, from New York and from Varvara in Bulgaria, about Georgi Markov, who lived so many years ago. And I think it's wonderful that there's sort of a resurgence of interest in his work, not only in the murder itself, but in the kind of, I think he has a lot to tell us about our current moment, because I think, you know, I mean, it's a very different cultural moment, very different technological moment. But I think some of the things he went through could, you know, there are lessons to be learned there, definitely, in our own time.
No, definitely. And yeah, it's been really fascinating. And thanks so much, Milena and EKF and Capital Literature, for having us talk about this. And thanks to the birds in Dimiter's background for giving us like a wonderful sort of little background sound. They were listening really carefully too, which is nice. And yeah, I mean, there are more events coming this week,
Yes,
right, Milena?
yes, but first, thank you so much, both of you. And for our guests, be on the lookout for the double celebration. So Markov's novellas coming by Penguin's book, and Kenarov's biography of Markov coming by Grove Atlantic, hopefully next year. But in the meantime, we continue with the series. And next week on 29th of June, the same time, we will have chat posts conversing with Natalia Deleva. Open Letter are publishing her novel, 4 Minutes, this month of August. And also she will be talking about another author by Open Letter, Dubravka Ogresic. So hope to see you next week. Thank you so much again. Until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, Nico.